Hello, everybody. I'm Clifford Shannon, welcoming you on behalf of the 9/11 Memorial Museum to this program dealing with really what's on the front pages of the newspapers and what's at the top of your news feeds, the situation in Afghanistan with the impending American withdrawal to be completed tomorrow. I'm joined today by Ambassador Edmund Fitton-Brown, who is a former British diplomat and is currently the coordinator of the UN Analytical Support and Sanctions Monitoring Team, which is a mouthful, but it actually is the group within the UN system that monitors the activities of the Islamic State, al-Qaeda, and the Taliban, all of which have been subjected to UN-designated sanctions. And it's his group that makes the reports to the UN and thus to the international community on the threats posed by those groups. He had a long career in the British government's diplomatic service. He was ambassador to the Republic of Yemen, and also starting in 1984 was posted in Dubai, Riyadh, Cairo, Kuwait, Rome, and Helsinki. And pleased also to welcome Ronald Neumann, a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in our American State Department. He was 3 times an American ambassador to Algeria, Bahrain, and of course in Afghanistan, July 2005 to April 2007. Before Afghanistan, he also served in Iraq from 2004, February 2004, with the Coalition Provisional Authority there, and as the embassy's liaison with the multinational command. Ambassador Neumann is the author of a memoir, 3 Embassies, 4 Wars, a personal memoir, that's 2017, and The Other War, Winning and Losing in Afghanistan from 2009. He has returned to Afghanistan repeatedly and has, as you might have noticed in the media, spoken out a good deal about the current events there. We had told you that Ambassador Raz, the ambassador from Afghanistan to the United States, was going to join us. Unfortunately, we got a late this morning note from her saying that she would not be able to do this. I do hope that at some future point, we will be able to present her in this forum. Just a couple of points before we get started here. If you need captions for this program, you can click on the link at the bottom of your screen. If you'd like to submit a question, there's a chat bubble on your screen at the bottom right, and you can put that question into the chat bubble. So that out of the way, gentlemen, thank you very much for taking the time to do this. You have both been closely following the situation, both been involved in the situation there, have been to the country numerous times, know it well. We'll talk about the particulars of the various outcomes here now, but as you've been watching what's gone on at the airport and then the reporting from inside the country in recent days and weeks, what is the predominant feeling that you have? What is really the thing that has jumped out at you? Let me start with Ambassador Neumann.
Okay. Predominant feeling I have is one of national shame and disgrace for the United States. The decision to withdraw is a debatable one. I think one can have strong and important reasons on both sides of that debate. The process of carrying out that decision has been a lamentable disaster with a great many of perfectly foreseeable problems which were not addressed. And in calling them foreseeable, I would point both to a piece I wrote back in July after coming back from Kabul and another piece in the Atlantic Council website, which was written with a number of my former ambassadorial colleagues, in which we were pointing out some of the things that we thought needed to be done. I believe that the way we have withdrawn is a significant part of the responsibility for the collapse of the Afghan forces, though that is shared with both the incompetence of the Afghan government recently and also the Trump administration, which began a process of undermining their morale. So I think it is decision to leave the longest war agree with it, but defensible. Conduct leaving it absolutely indefensible. And right now we are standing in front of a very large moral chasm of abandoning behind us both people who served with us and people who bought into the values of the West and the United States over the last 20 years. And turning our back on them and saying, well, not everybody gets out at the end of a war, to all the women activists where we spent millions of dollars and a great deal of commitment saying, we're with you. I think that is a moral catastrophe. And I think the United States needs to open up, not only to make good on its legal commitment to the special immigrant visas, people who worked with us, but its moral commitment to the people who believed in us, with a much larger refugee program, which will be a political discussion of some depth in the United States, but I think we need to pay our debts.
Ambassador Fitton-Brown, you are currently an international civil servant at the UN, but you also represented your country, Great Britain, and which was closely allied with the United States in Afghanistan. So you have essentially sort of a split perspective, if you will. I mean, what strikes you most powerfully in these powerful scenes that you're seeing?
I think most of all, my concern is the uncertainty. I mean, I won't speak from a UK perspective. That's not my role anymore. But my concern is the extremist and terrorist groups in Afghanistan. That's always been my concern because that's my current role, to monitor those groups and to support the sanctions regimes against them. So my concern is to see this rapid change in Afghanistan and to understand what it means for the future of those elements in Afghanistan and the extent to which that could become a problem also for the outside world.
Let me ask, because, we are talking now about the Taliban taking power. And from the reports that your office has issued, the presence of al-Qaeda in Afghanistan alongside the Taliban, whether in Afghanistan or in exile or in sanctuaries in Pakistan, that has been consistent over time. And so while a Taliban spokesman said recently that his government would not support attacks against the United States from within Afghanistan, he also cast doubt on whether Osama bin Laden was responsible for 9/11. So there really is no particular reason to have any confidence in that separation, if you will. But can you give us a sense, on the basis of the most recent reporting, which I think goes back to June of this year, what is the nature of the relationship and the closeness between the Taliban, al-Qaeda, and related groups? We can come to the ISIS question a little bit later.
Thank you. Yes. And I think this is the really important point. I mean, you said about the possibility of trusting the Taliban or taking them at their word. Clearly not. That's why you have. That's why we exist, because we are there to monitor, including monitoring what the Taliban does and the threat that it poses to peace and security in Afghanistan. Now, we have said, as you observe from our reports, we have said that the Taliban remains very closely linked to al-Qaeda. It's never broken its contacts with al-Qaeda. It's not just a matter of sympathy between the groups. There's the shared history, but there's also intermarriage. There are familial relations. The groups fight alongside each other. We have observed that the Taliban's refusal to admit to the presence of al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, their refusal to admit to the presence of foreign terrorist fighters amongst their own ranks, gives us no confidence that they are going to deal honestly with the international community on these issues. And I would just highlight the appearance of Amin al-Haq in Nangarhar, which has just been reported, a major sanctioned al-Qaeda figure, clearly still hand in glove with the Taliban.
Ambassador Neumann, your sense of the threat, and also, if you would, President Biden has said that even though American forces are being withdrawn, that we would still have what he called this over-the-horizon capacity to deal with threats in that area. It's hard to track that in light of the fact that when we had people on the ground, we were still dealing with those threats, and not always with complete effectiveness. So what do you see as the security consequence of where we are now and the vulnerability of the U.S. to threats emanating from these areas that we're leaving behind?
It's a very important question, and it's one where obviously it's speculative because we don't have, none of us have a crystal ball. I totally agree with Ambassador Fitton-Brown's perspective on the links between al-Qaeda and the Taliban. Perhaps even stronger when you get down to al-Qaeda and Haqqani movement within the Taliban. In addition, one has to say, is there a plot right today against the United States? I don't know of one. Looking out more broadly, there were stories yesterday that I saw of celebrations by celebratory statements by al-Qaeda linked elements in North Africa to the fall of the success of the Taliban in Kabul. This is a huge propaganda defeat of the United States, and this is a defeat, and the defeat of NATO with us, I'm sorry to say. This is a huge propaganda for every sort of piece of the jihadist universe. Example that God is on their side, and something to give them courage and strength to continue their war. I believe that makes it likely that we will face increased threats. But, somebody else will poo-poo that. I think when it comes down to the ability to control this from over the horizon, in a strategic sense, I think that's nonsense. In the sense that you can carry out a strike here or there, as one former director of Special Forces Worldwide pointed out to me, yes, you can carry out a hostage rescue mission, or a one-off. It's longer range. If you have to use people instead of missiles, it's more risky and harder to do. But to have strategic effect, to control terrorism, to control al-Qaeda, no, that wasn't fully possible when we were there. It was a year or two ago, I don't remember exactly the date now, when we discovered a rather large al-Qaeda base, was quite large in Afghanistan. It had apparently been there for about 6 months before we discovered it with all of our assets in country. Anybody who thinks we're going to carry that stuff out with the sundering of many of our human intelligence assets as well. Yes, we have the technical, but the human intelligence element has always been critical, and they're being hunted down and killed right now.
Ambassador Fitton-Brown, this idea of a triumphant narrative has always been at the heart of the rally on behalf of al-Qaeda or like-minded groups that, as Ambassador Neumann states, believe that they are on the side of God, and therefore, regardless of the odds, that they will carry forward in triumph. Is this something that would, I can only imagine, affirm that sense of narrative? And how important do you think that sense of narrative is in moving these groups ahead?
Well, the groups are keen on their narrative, both ISIL and al-Qaeda. And it's certainly true that we've seen a round of triumphal propaganda from al-Qaeda affiliates around the world based on what's happened. That we've also seen ISIL complain about it because, of course, from ISIL's point of view, they are opposed to the Taliban and the Taliban's message, and so they're trying to play this down as best they can. I think the one thing I would say that we need to be a little careful here is the triumphal narrative is one thing. This is what they do. There's an awful lot of online celebration and gloating. And we've seen this even in the most absurd contexts, like you will see these groups celebrating hurricanes in the US and things like that. In a way, we should not forget that this is also a sign of weakness. It's a sign that these groups are desperate to try to present success. And I think just coming back to a point that was made earlier, al-Qaeda has suffered very severe set. So the narrative that al-Qaeda is weak
and go in closer
leaders and is currently capable of projecting an external threat. I think it's important to remember that that is based in inaccurate analysis and very strong counterterrorism operations. So in a way, yes, the propaganda is of concern. It's not necessarily a statement of strength. The concern, of course, is if groups are able to consolidate and ultimately regenerate both the resources and the capability to project an external threat.
Let me ask then about the strategic impact of this. Ambassador Neumann, you spoke about a moral chasm that we stand in front of for having abandoned the people who believed in us in Afghanistan over 20 years. It was at this point that American diplomacy seemed, anyway, to give a much higher priority to the rights of women, for example, in different parts of the world. And yet, this withdrawal and the idea that we simply could not sustain the changes in Afghanistan that we wanted to see does seem to have enormous implications, of course, for Afghanistan, but implications that go beyond that and go to the nature of what is at the heart of what U.S. foreign policy is, and on the other hand, may claim to be. Does this expose us beyond the idea that nations pursue their own interests? Everybody understands that. But if we add something about democracy or women's rights or these other things that are supposed to be fundamental, yet we abandon them, can we continue to make the case that we represent something beyond the assertion only of national interest?
I think you put it very well. The case is, we will continue to make the case. We have a lot of people in America who believe in it, but making that case to recalcitrant foreigners will be much harder. It's easy to make the case to people who agree with us. Making it to people who don't, that will be a bit harder. I could say as well that the Russians, for instance, will enjoy greatly pointing out the contradictions between our words and our actions.
Ambassador Fitton-Brown, 20 years, an entire generation of Afghans is born into a country that at that point, 20 years ago, had the Taliban, as rulers anyway, in the rearview mirror. And now, of course, a new Taliban, or a new generation of Taliban, it's not clear which, has taken power. How do you assess the continuities between that initial group of Taliban, the way they ran the country, which was, to say the very least, quite severe, and what the next generation of Taliban represents, and the sense of whether or not there's been any reason to think that this is not simply going to be a replay of what happened the last time?
Well, again, my focus, of course, in this will always be on the relation with counterterrorism and international security. So the question primarily to me sounds like, is it likely that the Taliban would repeat the mistakes that they made in the 1990s and onwards in relation to their hosting of al-Qaeda and their protection, effectively, their readiness to allow al-Qaeda to incubate and deliver the threat that it did. So that, to me, that's the key question. And of course, there is a secondary question that I'm sure we're coming to in due course about the situation regarding ISIL. Now, with al-Qaeda, clearly there's no evidence of a separation between the Taliban and al-Qaeda. We're clear on that, having looked closely at it. We don't find great disagreement amongst member states that we talk to about the fact that Taliban and al-Qaeda remain close. There is also the issue, of course, of, I think you alluded to it earlier, large numbers of foreign terrorist fighters in Afghanistan, other terrorist groups, which mainly tend to lean towards al-Qaeda and tend to be under the protection, under the umbrella of the Taliban. So the grounds for optimism there are not strong, but the Taliban has said that they are determined to prevent the projection of a threat from Afghanistan. That is something that was clear within what they signed up to. The question is, are they genuinely able to do that, or genuinely willing to do that? And I think for that purpose, we simply have to emphasize to them that they have to live up to that commitment, because unless they do so, then obviously that is going to affect the attitude of the international community towards them.
Ambassador Neumann, your sense, I was going to say old wine in a new bottle, but that's not appropriate under the circumstances. But, is this a different Taliban we might have different expectations for? Or are we really simply going to see the reassertion of their interpretation of what it means to run a state under Islamic law?
We really don't know the answer to that. I mean, all answers to that are guesswork. Not in terms of their relationship with al-Qaeda, that's pretty clear, but in terms of how they will govern handling women, education, tolerating somebody without a beard or with different clothes. We'll have to see. They sing a better song, and that's good. Is that entirely for the foreigners? I don't know. Right now, what one hears is the Taliban saying, amnesty for all who fought against us, and what one hears also are constant stories coming out of executions of regime people. And remember that in the early phase of a revolutionary takeover, you usually have quite a bit of blood and chaos. And what the regime is going to look like when it steadies down into whatever it steadies down into is something we're going to have to see. And so that there's no point in proceeding on a basis of faith. We want certain things. We have a few implements left diplomatically, financial assistance, things like that. That hand will have to be played very carefully to see if it can help bring about some more acceptable governance. But that's a long game that has to be played.
Let me follow up there, Ambassador Neumann, just one point. There's been talk about leverage that we might have because so much of the Afghan budget depends on foreign assistance. Their holdings and reserves have been frozen. It is presumed that they would like to resume some kind of financial relationships with the outside world. I mean, it's kind of crazy to be thinking about reconstituting influence under these circumstances, but do you have any hope that actually could be a way of leveraging certain kinds of desired outcomes in relations with the Taliban?
Well, I'll always have hope. I think people exaggerate the degree of influence that financial leverage gives you. There is a sense that you can just command and make something happen. And that's very difficult to do. Taliban are going to be under multiple pressures from their own ideology, from people within their rank and file who are not inclined to become modernists. It's also important to remember that we haven't really talked about ISIS, I want to call it Daesh, But remember that Mr. Fitton-Brown can probably speak with more authority, but a great many of their components, their people in Afghanistan, to the best of my knowledge, are Afghan, most of whom came out of the ranks of the Taliban. Now, that happens for various reasons, but the fact is the Taliban will have to contend with having a more radical element on their flank that can attract people if they themselves don't seem to have sufficient ideological fervor. So there are going to be a lot of pressures on them. And we in the West have pressures that we can put. And then it becomes a complicated question of, well, how much pressure for what? If the Taliban are able to cut off drugs, for instance, and they restrict terrorism, will you do any aid? Or will you say, no, I've got to have a rather long list of civil human rights? Maybe you should. If you get some of that and then you begin to get backsliding, will you cut off the programs that you've begun? And where do you figure in humanitarian aid in all this? The first approximation answer will be yes, humanitarian aid if delivered by internationals, not through the Taliban. But suppose that doesn't work very well. Are you then prepared to have people starve rather than to deliver the aid? So these are going to be very tough questions, and the answers are probably going to be very mixed. And the only thing I can be really sure of is they're going to be a damn sight more complex than most people think, who trot out easy answers of how our influence is still going to be so important.
Let me ask Ambassador Fitton-Brown, it's really two questions, because I do want to bridge into the ISIS, Islamic State, essentially, question. But first, your office is there to understand the impact of UN sanctions on the Taliban, on al-Qaeda, and so on and so forth. And I wonder if, just by way of clarification, you could sort of give us the current state of play that the Taliban faces in relation to these international sanctions.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a good segue as well, having just talked about their financial assets, and also Ambassador Neumann's mention of humanitarian accesses, where there's obviously a very strong imperative to make sure that humanitarian aid does get through. And then obviously the issue arises of what Taliban officials might be involved in that chain. In terms of the sanctions themselves, there have not been many new listings under the 1988 so-called sanctions regime, which is the one on the targeted sanctions against named Taliban figures. In recent years, we've not had very many new listings. So, as an example, the current leader of the Taliban, Haybatullah, is not himself listed, but a lot of leading Taliban are listed. And one of the most active aspects of the sanctions regime recently has been in providing consecutive travel ban exemptions to those Taliban figures who were involved in the negotiations process over the last couple of years. So that's been one example of where the sanctions regime has been active. But the sanctions are they're pretty strong when they take effect. And of course, it's an interesting transition from a group conducting an insurgency, which to a large degree perhaps wasn't directly hurt by the sanctions against the named individuals. But if those named individuals get into positions where they're expecting to travel, or positions where they're expecting to transact business, financial business, you can see that actually that becomes a fairly serious impediment to their being able to do business. So thought will definitely need to be given on all sides to working out what the future significance of the sanctions is.
Let me ask then, and Ambassador Fitton-Brown first. We saw with the bombing at the airport the other day that was attributed to Islamic State in Khorasan, so the local Islamic State organization, that this clearly poses not just a threat to the Afghans trying to leave, and of course the Americans trying to evacuate them, but over a longer term, it's clear that this is a threat to the Taliban and their rule. And both you and Ambassador Neumann have alluded to this being an alternative option for those who think the Taliban, in whatever form it takes, is going to be too moderate. So what can you tell us about the scale of this organization as it currently stands? We did see from some of your reports and others that the military campaign against them was quite effective in reducing their numbers and reducing their reach. And this may be something where the US and the Taliban actually have a common interest. They may have collaborated on certain activities previously. But can you give us a picture of this organization at this point in time and the nature of its threat to the Taliban's rule in Afghanistan?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, just the briefest of background. We used to assess the sort of fighting strength of ISIL-K, as I'll call it ISIL-K, but we can call it Daesh, Khorasan, or whatever. We used to assess the fighting strength back in sort of 2017, 2018, around 4,000. And they suffered a series of military setbacks, starting in the north in Jawzjan in the summer of 2018, and then even bigger and more significant setbacks in their heartland in eastern Afghanistan, in Nangarhar, towards the end of 2019. And that then continued over into early 2020. Some of the ISIL fighters moved north into the province of Kunar. They were in very inhospitable terrain in deep winter. It was very difficult. They lost a lot of people, and a lot of people surrendered, and a lot of their dependents also surrendered. Now, as you say, the hostile forces that they were having to contend with included the Taliban, as well as the government of Afghanistan and the government of Afghanistan's international allies. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it's reasonable to say that over a period when the Taliban were mainly engaged in fighting with ISIL-K, that it was possible to say, well, they seem to be suppressing that particular threat, weakening that particular terrorist group. Nowadays, we assess the fighting strength of ISIL-K at more like 2,000, so roughly half what we used to say. But we also think that their focus has shifted. So rather than being an organization holding territory and smuggling routes in eastern Afghanistan, some of them are still in Nangarhar, but not in the numbers that they were, not as a significant ground-holding force. They seem to have turned their attention towards urban spectacular attacks, primarily in Kabul. And of course, they have no qualms about whom they kill. They've always been happy to claim any attack, no matter how heinous it might be considered by most normal people, and indeed even by some people who consider terrorism to be sometimes justified, would nevertheless find the ISIL claims of these attacks to be pretty blood-curdling. So that emphasis has changed. They have a different leader. They lost a couple of leaders recently, and the current leader is a guy called Shahab al-Muhajir, who used to be responsible for their attack operations in Kabul. So you can see why there's been some shift in the emphasis. I think one important point to make, and I think Ambassador Neumann made this point really well earlier, about just the sheer complexity of the situation and also the conflict dynamic, the chaos that exists. This is not something that is happening according to plan or happening according to neat organograms. This is something a little bit more reminiscent of gangs or medieval barons fighting things out. The Taliban itself is not monolithic. It has factions. It has different interests within it. And again, Ambassador Neumann first mentioned the Haqqani network earlier in this interview. And it's really important to remember that the Taliban encompasses elements like the Haqqani network, which has the tactical autonomy to do whatever it wants to do that it judges to be in the strategic interests of the Taliban. And this is important when we try to assess what's happening in Afghanistan now, is to understand that the Haqqani network is capable of doing most things and doing them deniably and not ever having them claimed by the Taliban. In some cases, they may well then be claimed by ISIL-K. So I think that is the really important sort of rider that needs to be placed on any sort of good guys and bad guys analysis that somebody tries to make about Afghanistan right now.
Ambassador Neumann, I do want to get to the question of how this all happened. 20 years of enormous investment on our part by the Afghans themselves, by our NATO and other allies. And yes, I take your point that the end has not been handled well, but even if you put that aside, as you acknowledged, after 20 years, there are legitimate arguments to be made that this just needed to end, even if it could have ended better. One of your diplomatic colleagues, Ryan Crocker, had a piece in the New York Times recently where he said, essentially, we do not have the strategic patience to stick with it. The Taliban, ideologically motivated, as is al-Qaeda, as are the others, can simply outweight us. Now, there's much more to it than that. But do you find that Ambassador Crocker makes a good point here in the sense that we, and perhaps our allies as well, can simply be outweighted in these situations?
It is a good point. Ryan Crocker's a very old friend, going back to days in Iran before the revolution. And yes, we lack strategic patience. We also lack the wisdom to acknowledge it, so that we are inclined to get into things that require patience and then not really wish to accept that. And that was true of Vietnam. It was true it's not a function of one administration or another. And if you look at this is a really complex subject. This is 20 years, and I'm hesitant to sum it up in bumper sticker phrases. But there are two facts that strike me repeatedly, among many others. One is that by my count, we have had 10 different policies in Afghanistan. So it's not a matter of having had one policy that we were trying for 20 years and we couldn't make it work. We've changed policy every couple of years. That in itself is a symptom both of the lack of patience and also of the fact that whenever things don't go well, we don't tend to look at whether it's the execution of policy or the time duration needed. We tend to think it's a policy problem. So we want to change the policy. That's a problem. And then we rotate people constantly. So part of our lack of strategic patience is also the lack of learning, that we constantly are relearning. And this phrase that I first heard in relation to Vietnam, that we don't have 12 years experience, we have 1 year's experience 12 times. Well, now we have 1 year's experience 20 times. That hasn't really changed. And so we lack strategic patience, and we are over imbued with what you might call strategic arrogance. That made in the West solutions can be adapted and made to work. And sometimes I think they can be, but on a very different time scale. And just to remind, in Korea, the country at the end of the war was at least as devastated as Afghanistan. You had, I think, 7 years of very corrupt government under Sigmund Rhee. You had a military coup, and you had 20 or 30 years before you got to real economic development and democracy. And that was without having an ongoing war. So Yes, we lack strategic patience, but we also lack the willingness to admit it.
Ambassador Fitton-Brown, and this may get into a policy question that you may not be comfortable with, but I'm going back to the report I mentioned by your office that came earlier this year, assessing the situation in Afghanistan. And it was at that point, and I'll ask Ambassador Neumann about this after, it was at that point that the negotiations between the US and the Taliban, which had essentially sidelined the Afghan government, did create an environment in which the American intention to leave was made very clear. And the essential momentum of the situation seemed to shift to the Taliban, as I said before, with the Afghan government sideline. Now, your work is documentary in the sense that you are drawing from intelligence services and the views of member states and so on and so forth. So, what I'm trying to get at is the sense within the international community, particularly those who were especially attentive to this issue, whether the very sort of dry way in which your report puts forward the outcome or the impact of these negotiations, what that really felt like at a more granular level, if you could.
Yeah, so I'm not quite sure how to answer that question. I mean, I think we respond to what member states want of us and what the committee wants of us. And yeah, I have no particular comment to make on the way that the peace process evolved over the period that you're referring to. I think what we did say in our last report was that we were concerned that the Taliban did not appear to be preparing for peace. They appeared to be preparing for war. And we mentioned in that connection, their pre-positioning around strategic cities and just the appointments that they were making that suggested that they were empowering hardline commanders. That was definitely a concern that there would then be I think we said it explicitly that we expected to see the Taliban step up their military campaign during the course of this year, and they did so. And of course, the thing that I guess nobody, at least to the best of my knowledge, predicted on the record was quite how quickly it changed.
Ambassador Neumann, those negotiations, you've been critical of them, the Trump administration's negotiations without bringing the Afghan government into it, which essentially put some conditions to the Taliban that they never really observed, that released some 5,000 prisoners, including many who have risen back to the command level of the Taliban, some who were even involved in ISIS movements there. I believe in other comments you've made that you see that negotiation as having essentially undermined whatever was left of the strength of the Afghan government, the Afghan army, and setting the stage for where we are in terms of the withdrawal, if not the conditions under which the withdrawal is carried out.
I have, although I think it's important to recognize that there is a difference between the negotiation itself, how we implemented it, and then how we carried forth. Because there is a logic to the argument that we had to promise a troop withdrawal on some time frame in order to get the Taliban to engage in negotiations. And you can argue both sides of that question, but it has some validity. But when we reached the negotiation, signed the agreement, several things happened. One is we insisted that this was going to be conditions-based. And that was Secretary Pompeo and Secretary of Defense Esper both making those statements. And that there was to be pressure on the Taliban to comply with what, in some senses, one might say was the understanding that there would be serious negotiations. What you had then with the Trump administration was to obviously drop any conditionality. So that we said it would be conditions-based, but we then advanced the troop withdrawal unilaterally and well beyond the schedule of the agreement. We pushed the Afghans to stand on the defensive, which not completely. I mean, we were still backing them up with air support, but this handed the strategic initiative to the Taliban. We pushed hard for the release of these prisoners that the Afghan government didn't want. So we took a series of measures then which undercut the conditionality that had supposedly been a portion of the agreement. The combination of these actions, as much as the agreement itself, is what has raised increasing doubt among Afghans about where the United States stood, how much you could depend on it, and some of which goes back before. I mean, we used the conditions-based phrase in the Obama administration and then proceeded to ignore it totally as we got our troops out of the country. It's on a time basis. So American credibility has been undermined by American actions, and that has been a serious problem.
Yes, there's another recent essay in the New York Times, this by General Sami Sadat of the Afghan National Army. He writes, August 25th, "It's true that the Afghan army lost its will to fight, but that's because of the growing sense of abandonment by our American partners and the disrespect and disloyalty reflected in Mr. Biden's tone and words over the past few months. The Afghan army is not without blame. It had its problems, cronyism, bureaucracy, elsewhere he mentions corruption. But he adds, we ultimately stopped fighting because our partners already had." Let me ask Ambassador Fitton-Brown, and again, I understand there are policy implications to this, but how were you able to track over more recent times the impact of these changes on the Afghan army's ability or willingness to fight? As you assess the threat and the relative strength of the Taliban and others, were you able to see this dramatic decline of the Afghan army, of course, to the point where essentially they just stopped fighting and disappeared as best they could?
No, we weren't able to track that. I mean, we continued to work with the Afghan authorities really all the way through to this summer. Of course, we were working with them on more specifically on things related to the presence of various terrorist groups in Afghanistan. They also were consulting us on various issues relating to the sanctions regimes. So there was a live contact between us and them. Of course, one of the one of the sort of peculiar features of the last 18 months, elephant in the room, if you like, COVID-19, obviously had a very significant impact upon the interaction of a number of internationals with the Afghans. Afghanistan has quite a serious COVID problem, as I'm sure you know. We were frequent travelers to Afghanistan, but our last visit to Afghanistan took place in March 2020, and then COVID hit. And so we had become reliant over a period of nearly a year and a half on remote contact through video teleconference facilities and other forms of remote contact. And maybe that had an impact on our sort of reading of the situation. But of course, we weren't tracking anyway, particularly the sort of readiness of the Afghan forces. We reported in our last report that they had about 300,000 armed forces, as against their target level, I think, of about 340,000, if I remember correctly. So we observed that they were under strength. But we at the same time, and of course one should never set too much store by numbers, but people are always interested in numbers, and you have to report numbers. We were talking about Taliban numbers that were something in the region of a quarter of that. So yeah, I mean, as I said, the speed at which things happened over this summer came as a surprise to us, as to many others.
So, Ambassador Neumann, it's been frequently the source of comment, that numbers disparity that Ambassador Fitton-Brown just mentioned. And we know the possibility of sort of phantom army units, so the numbers are not necessarily something you could swear by. But again, I'm going back to General Sadat's commentary, he writes, why did the Afghan military collapse? Threefold answer. First, former President Trump's peace deal with the Taliban in Doha doomed us. It put an expiration date on American interest in the region. Second, we lost contractor logistics and maintenance support critical to our combat operations. And there, he's really referring to air support for their ground troops. And third, the corruption endemic in President Ghani's government that flowed to senior military leadership and long crippled our forces on the ground, hobbled us. Is that, do you think, a comprehensive assessment of how everything went south so quickly?
It'll do till a better one comes along. I don't know General Sadat personally. I will say that he was by reputation the best corps commander in Afghanistan, and that he was carrying on an extremely hard fight for weeks in Lashkar and Helmand before the final collapse. So I would give him a lot of credit. And I would say that what he has said about the air support contract, all true. I think what people missed when they were looking at how long the Afghan government would last, the army, is the question of morale. That Napoleon referred to that as either 6 or 10 to 1 against force, depending on which quote you like. The morale and the willingness to fight is a much more important factor than the arms one has in many cases. I mean, I was a soldier in Vietnam, but it is the most intangible and the hardest to measure. And so you had the problem of corruption. The problem of corruption was there all along. The Afghan army was losing more dead every year in the last several than we lost America in the whole war. So there was a willingness to fight, and then the willingness to fight changed. And that's a question of morale. And that had multiple causes, but our actions undermined it in an enormously significant way. And so after the Biden decision particularly, this seemed to many Afghans to just cement the idea that we were leaving. When I was in Kabul in July, one of the rumors going around was quite idiotic, but it was believed by many, was that America had actually changed its position and decided to back the Taliban, because this was the conclusion that people drew. So when you look and say, are they willing to fight? The question is to fight for what, with what chance of survival? And as we seem to pull away the support, that chance of survival went down. And then I would say the other element that was overlooked, but I'm not in the government anymore. I'm not reading the intelligence analysis, but Afghan history is replete with tipping points. Wars generally have not ended in a climactic battle. They've ended when one side felt that the action was hopeless, and then they'd leave. They might fight very hard until that point. Doesn't mean they ran away easily at all. But you didn't get to climactic battle. You got to a survival tactic. And that was true. That was true when the Taliban originally went to Kabul. It was true very much in 2001 after the larger battles in the north. The collapse of the Taliban came very quickly. And it was not unknown. And I wrote about it. Others wrote about it. The whole question of tipping point has been discussed frequently by scholars of Afghanistan, but it just wasn't something that seemed to take place in our annals. Now, I'm not claiming that I predicted how fast it would go. I did write in July that once the cities started to fall, if the Afghan government didn't hold, that could snowball and go very rapidly. But I didn't say, it's 2 weeks and, mark your watch. But there was a possibility there for a collapse of morale. The collapse of morale was observable. A number of us, analysts and diplomats, were writing about it. And there were actions to shore up morale, and we didn't take them. And that is why I believe that our policies had a significant, but not an exclusive responsibility for the collapse.
Let me ask, we're coming to time here. As you both know, we are coming to the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. President Biden, in announcing initially his intention to leave, made clear he wanted to be out on or by 9/11/2021. I wonder if either of you could reflect on sort of the symbolic moment that 9/11 represents from both perspectives, whether the American, the international, or the Taliban perspective. Ambassador Fitton-Brown, it's not necessarily something you would come across, but clearly it's the context for everything that's happened over the last 20 years.
Yeah, I think internationally that it's, I'd like to at least make one positive point, which is, I think for all the horror of 9/11 and for all of the difficulties that we've been through in the 20 years since, it absolutely revolutionized the international community's approach to dealing with the problem of terrorism. And it led to rapid learning of lessons about what worked and what didn't. It led to a rapid increase in international cooperation in the field of counterterrorism. And that in itself carries a lot of benefits in terms of bringing people together within the rules-based international system. It's very striking that counterterrorism, and particularly the struggle against ISIL and al-Qaeda, is something on which almost all countries agree. And certainly it's a point on which there's a very high level of consensus within the United Nations and within the Security Council. I think it's interesting that now, 20 years on, people are thinking not only in terms of hard counterterrorism, enforcement, punitive action, but also thinking in terms of other aspects of counterterrorism, countering and preventing violent extremism, combating the underlying factors, making, where appropriate, links between security and development issues, and in counterterrorism itself, taking due account of key issues like legal compliance and a due regard for human rights. Something that the United Nations has, got into in this period. Of course, the various UN efforts on counterterrorism have been established and have grown and evolved during this period. And the UN now takes on a major role in terms of building international capacity in the counterterrorism sphere, and that capacity that they build adds to a sense of mutual compatibility and compliance between the different member states and the different counterterrorism agencies that are seeking to work together. So the last thing I guess I would say on this is that whilst it would never be, one would never want to overstate and say that counterterrorism matters more than anything else. I don't think that would be true to say that. But I think counterterrorism is important. I think that preventing populations from being traumatized by terrorist attacks is important. And I think that we're in a position now where international cooperation can continue to build upon what we've seen in the last 20 years and continue to keep people safer from terrorism in the future.
Ambassador Neumann, on this date, 20 years ago, the Taliban was running Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda had free reign, and essentially the 9/11 plot was in the works and would soon hit. 20 years later, we are leaving before the 20th anniversary. The Taliban, in rough shape, still perhaps can't fully assert any kind of control over the country. But if anybody's in charge, they are. And as we've established, the relationships with al-Qaeda have not diminished over the years. Are we simply turning back the clock 20 years? Or is the situation looking forward in your mind going to turn out differently than the last time?
Well, that famous statement that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. I think nobody knows the answer. It's a damn good question, but I don't have the answer. I think there are a few points one can make, and I'll try to be quick. One is that what Ambassador Fitton-Brown was just talking about progress in anti-terrorism, that's important. People say nothing is done in Afghanistan. Well, for 20 years, we have not had another major terrorist attack of the nature of New York, which we certainly would have if al-Qaeda could have had its way. That in itself is an accomplishment. And we have, as Ambassador spoke of, all of the increases in ways of coping with this and analyzing it performance. That said, September 11 is now Taliban Victory Day. That is the day in which the United States has officially conceded that it lost the war and took NATO down to defeat with it. Because NATO wasn't ready to pull out, we forced them out by our decision to withdraw. We will survive. Terrorism, I think, has probably never had the capacity to threaten our civilization, way of government. We may threaten it more if we overreact with social controls. But whether we have mastered the strategic patience question you raised, that's another piece, because while we have prevented a great deal and improved an enormous amount, terrorism is still with us, and it has metastasized, and we're dealing with al-Qaeda offshoots in Yemen and in the Maghreb and elsewhere, and we now have to deal with recurrent efforts by the Islamic State to reconstitute itself. There is no particular end in sight. We can contain this. We can probably prevent most large disasters, but we probably, given historical records, won't prevent every one. And that leaves us with the question of strategic patience that you raised, because there is no short-term answer to this. And we're going to be at this for a long time. Another big subject, which we don't have time for. But that is not something we're going to be able to walk away from, because it's going to continue to be there.
Well, I think if nothing else, it gives us the opportunity to come back to both of you down the road and have this conversation again. It seems like, unfortunately, the issues are not going away. I do want to thank our guests today. I think many of you who've watched these programs know that I've taken at the end to asking you to consider supporting the museum. We have recently launched a fund that supports our education programs, the Never Forget Fund, and you can go to neverforget.org, which is a way really of channeling your support for our mission to educate, in particular, this younger generation. We talked about 20 years in Afghanistan and a generation there that grew up without the Taliban. In our country, it's 20 years of a generation that has grown up in the shadow of 9/11. And now going forward, 20 plus years later, we will see further implications of that event. So I would ask that, if possible, you do consider turning towards support of the museum in its mission going forward. With that, I'd like to thank Edmund Fitton-Brown and Ronald Neumann for this really very important and enlightening discussion. And on that note, I thank all of you. This is Clifford Shannon for the 9/11 Memorial Museum. Goodbye.